County Circuit Court, where the controversial case of 13-year-old Lionel Tate is ongoing. The young boy was convicted of first-degree murder of a 6-year-old girl who had been in his house. This case would eventually make Tate the youngest American citizen to ever be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Lionel Tate was just 12 years old when he brutally murdered a 6-year-old girl named Tiffany Unick. On July 28, 1999, the kids were over at Lionel's home where his mother was the one watching the kids. She worked as a Florida state trooper and was scheduled to work an overnight shift. On that day, she fed the children and then went upstairs to take a nap while they played downstairs. 45 minutes later, Lionel went to tell his mother that Tiffany was not breathing. She immediately contacted 911 and then called Tiffany's mother to tell her that her daughter wasn't breathing. By the time the young girl was rushed to the hospital, she was pronounced dead. When an autopsy was carried out, it revealed that her legs, neck, and feet were seriously bruised and her skull was fractured. She also had a lacerated liver, a fractured rib, and a swollen brain. These same wounds would later be described as similar to those she would have sustained by falling from a 3-story building. After the autopsy reveal, Lionel became a prime suspect in Tiffany's murder and was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At the young age of 13, Tate was to be tried as an adult in court, and on January 25, 2001, the jury unanimously convicted Lionel Tate of first-degree murder.
We, the jury, find the defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree as charged in the indictment.
A few days after his 14th birthday, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Incarceration for your natural life.
According to Judge Joel T. Lazarus, the acts of Lionel Tate were not the playful acts of a child. The acts of Lionel Tate were cold, callous, and indescribably cruel. Although Tate didn't burst into tears as expected of a young teenager, his reaction showed that he didn't take the sentence well.
Lionel Tate would be the youngest at age 13 to be sentenced to life in prison. Lionel Tate was accused of murdering 6-year-old Tiffany Unick. Lionel's mother would babysit Tiffany. In July of 1999, Lionel stated that he performed a wrestling move on Tiffany and it resulted in her death. He lifted her in the air and slammed her on a table. Lionel's mom, the prosecutor of this case, stated due to Tiffany injuries of a broken skull, lacerated liver, broken ribs, he felt this was intentional, not an accident. Lionel's mom told the police she had went to sleep when all this occurred. The jury would find Lionel guilty and sentence him to life in prison. He was offered a plea to serve 3 years, but his lawyer and mom denied it. In 2001, his case was overturned. He was sent home on probation after getting another chance. Eventually, Lionel would get in trouble again for armed robbery of a pizza man and would be sentenced to 30 years in prison. He is currently serving his sentencing.
This 14-year-old was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, making him the youngest person to ever receive that sentence. So have you ever heard of Lionel Tate? Lionel was born on January 30th of 1988. As he grew up, people described him as having average intelligence, but he did have some street smarts. He did have some behavioral issues, as he had been kicked out of school about 15 times for stealing, lying, and fighting. And it seems like those behavioral issues were never properly addressed. Lionel was also not small. At 12 years old, he was almost 6 foot tall and weighed about 170 pounds. On the night of July 28, 1999, Kathleen, which was Lionel's mother, was asked to watch one of her closest friend's daughters, Tiffany Unick. Tiffany was just 6 years old at the time and was a fraction of the size of Lionel. She only weighed about 48 pounds. Sometime in the evening, Kathleen decided that she wanted to go upstairs to her room and left the 2 younger children alone downstairs. At about 10 p.m., both Lionel and Tiffany were getting kind of noisy, so Kathleen screamed down the stairs telling them to keep the noise down. She did not go downstairs and physically check on the children at this time. But at about 10:40, Lionel goes up to the room and tells Kathleen that Tiffany is not breathing. Lionel told Kathleen that they were play wrestling and that he had Tiffany in a headlock. He says that she then smashed her head onto a side table and then started rolling around on the floor where she urinated herself and was moaning, and he said she was acting like a baby. Lionel says that he left her alone and then sometime later went upstairs to get his mother when he noticed that she was not breathing anymore. By the time Kathleen got down to Tiffany, she was already cold. But upon closer examination, it would be revealed that Tiffany's injuries were far worse. She had bleeding in her brain, a cracked skull, a broken rib. Her kidneys were hemorrhaged. She had a lacerated liver. and she had so many bruises all over her body. A child abuse expert would testify in court saying that the beating had to have lasted about 5 minutes, and it was the equivalent of a fall from a 3-story building. But Lionel claimed that he was just practicing the wrestling moves that he had seen on TV. It would take several years, but in 2001, Lionel would go on trial for first-degree murder, and he would be tried as an adult. I'm going to go to part 2. It will be up down in the comments, but I have to film it first, so give me just a couple of minutes. Here is part 2 to the case of Lionel Tate. So while Lionel was being tried as an adult, the prosecution did not believe that there was any premeditation behind it. But they still did have to try it as felony murder because it was aggravated child abuse. The prosecution did offer Lionel a plea deal, plead guilty to second-degree murder, and he would serve 3 years in prison with 10 years probation. But Kathleen decided to turn this down. She wanted to plead not guilty to first-degree murder and try it in court. The defense argued that Lionel was just practicing wrestling moves on Tiffany and did not realize that this would cause such injury to Tiffany. It took the jury 2 weeks to come back with a guilty verdict. Now, being found guilty of this meant that it was a mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the conviction, there were so many people that came forward asking the judge for leniency on Lionel, including the prosecution team. The judge told the prosecution team that if they did not think he was guilty of first-degree murder, they shouldn't have charged him with first-degree murder. But in 2003, this conviction would be overturned because Lionel was never given a competency hearing of any kind. This is when Lionel took the initial plea deal that he was offered and pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was given the credit of time served and forced to wear an ankle monitor for 1 year, 10 years of probation, and 1,000 hours of community service with mandatory counseling. So in January of 2004, Lionel walked out of prison. Then in 2004, Lionel was arrested again when he was found outside of his home with a knife. The judge extended his probation to 15 years, but was told that if he found himself in trouble again, it would be a prison sentence. Then in 2005, Lionel was once again arrested, this time for aggravated armed robbery of a pizza man. The pizza man was able to pick him out of a lineup, so it does seem like it was Lionel. Well, at the time it did anyway, but he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. But later on, Lionel did claim that he was innocent of this crime, saying that it was somebody else who had done it. There was a private investigator who said that he could prove that it wasn't Lionel who had done this, but all of this just kind of fizzled out in 2007. So what are your thoughts on this case? Do you think that justice was served, or do you think that all of this needs to be investigated a little bit further? Personally, I think that all of this could have been prevented had Lionel's behavioral issues just been addressed in the proper way in the first place. But let me know your thoughts on this and follow for more true crime.
So this 12-year-old boy here, he's about to go to prison for life. Let's call him Sting. And Sting is a huge fan of pro wrestling. He loves watching WWE. His favorite was always The Rock. So one day, Sting's mom, who we'll call Mom gets a call from her friend asking if she can babysit her daughter. And the daughter we'll call Six, because she's 6. So friend asks Mom if she can babysit Six, and Mom's like, of course, bring her over. So there Mom is, babysitting Six. And Sting's there too, and Mom feeds them, and then she lets them watch TV. Then she heads upstairs to lay down, leaving Sting and Six downstairs to watch TV. And Sting, the big WWE fan, he doesn't want to watch TV. He wants to wrestle. So he and Six, they start play fighting, and he's showing her some moves. But Sting is much bigger than her. He's around 170 pounds, while she is about 50 pounds. So he's throwing her around the room, and he's like putting her in a headlock, and he's doing all kinds of moves. And he's getting really rough. Not to mention, they're getting loud. They're getting so loud that at one point, Mom calls out for them to quiet the hell down. Now at this point, Sting and Six have only been downstairs alone for about 45 minutes. And at around the 45-minute mark is when Sting goes upstairs. And he goes into his mom's room, because something's wrong. And Sting wakes his mom up and he says, Mom, Six isn't breathing. So Mom jumps out of bed and then she rushes downstairs to check on her. And she finds Six laying there in the living room floor, not moving, unresponsive. And Mom immediately calls 911, but unfortunately, it's too late. Six doesn't make it. Sting had accidentally unalived her, being too rough with those wrestling moves. But then, the next day, the medical examiner performs an autopsy on Six, and she finds that Six has 35 injuries, including a cracked skull, a broken rib, all kinds of stuff. And because of that, the medical examiner rules Six's death a homicide, which means they have to charge 12-year-old Sting with murder. So then police go and arrest Sting, and he's 12, but here's his mugshot. And not only that, because of the way the laws are set up in that state, and because it's first-degree murder, they have to charge him as an adult. Which means if he gets found guilty, by law, he has to be sentenced to life. So then, boom, it's 2 years later. Sting is 14 years old now, and he's about to go on trial. So they come to Sting and they offer him a plea deal. Plead guilty and you won't get life in prison. Instead, you'll get 3 years of juvenile detention and 10 years probation. Not a bad deal. But Sting's mom believes this is all absurd. He was just a kid playing around, he's innocent, no jury will find him guilty. So she advises Sting not to take the deal. So he turns down the plea deal, and then guess what? A jury finds him guilty of first-degree murder. So at 14 years old, Sting goes to prison for life, which makes him the youngest person in the United States to ever receive a life sentence. Oh, but it gets worse. So Sting is in a juvenile prison for 3 years, and his attorney appeals his sentence, and after 3 years, it's actually overturned, because they argue that at 14 years old, Sting was not competent to stand trial in the adult court system. And it works, so now they have to let Sting go, and then they're going to straighten all that out, and then they're going to retrial him. But instead of having him go through the whole trial process again, they offer him a plea deal again. Instead of going back to trial and facing life in prison, 1 year house arrest and 10 years probation. And this is a really good deal. So this time, Sting takes it. And now at 18 years old, he's finally walking out of prison. No life sentence, he's finally out and he's happy, and now he has his whole life ahead of him. Until about a year later, after he's out, Sting is at someone he know's apartment, and he gets this weird idea, and so he calls Domino's and orders a pizza. And when the pizza delivery man shows up, Sting suddenly, like out of nowhere, pulls out a pew-pew and demands that he give him all his money. Sting has decided to rob the pizza guy. So pizza guy's like, F this, and he runs away. And he goes back to Domino's, and he immediately calls the police. And so police, they show up to the apartment, they identify Sting, and they arrest him. Here's his mugshot. And they charge him with armed robbery, violating his parole, and a bunch of other stuff. He goes back to court, pleads guilty, and after all that, beating a life sentence and everything, he ends up getting sentenced to 30 years in prison. And all this happened in Florida, so shout out to Florida.
I was sentenced to life in prison when I was 13. My name is Lionel Tate, and I was once a controversial figure, a young man filled with remorse and self-blame. This is a story about my path to redemption. When I was just 13 years old, I was playing with a young boy. We were wrestling at home, but an unfortunate incident occurred. In a careless moment, he was severely injured and tragically lost his life. I was charged with the crime of murder and faced severe charges as a minor. Throughout the trial, I felt abandoned by the world. Despite my attempts to explain that it was an accident, the court showed no sympathy for my situation. I was sentenced to life imprisonment, a punishment that felt immeasurably heavy for a teenager. In prison, I went through prolonged periods of introspection and inner turmoil. However, just when I was on the verge of despair, a fellow inmate gave me hope. He told me that even though I had made mistakes, I still had a chance to change and become a better person. Guided by my cellmate, I started reflecting on my past, accepting my mistakes, and striving to grow. I enrolled in educational programs, learning self-control and impulse management skills. I also began reading extensively on psychology and philosophy, seeking inner peace and answers. In prison, I encountered a psychological counselor who helped me confront my traumas and pain. She encouraged me to explore my emotions and face challenges in a positive way. Over time, I slowly became more mature and composed. I started participating in educational initiatives, teaching self-control and impulse management skills to other young people. I wanted to prevent similar tragedies from happening again and bring hope to those who had lost it. My transformation did not go unnoticed. People began to see my efforts to change and recognize the potential for redemption within me. With their support, I was eventually granted a second chance.